Welcome to raconteurs-news.
Good evening and welcome to raconteurs-news. It's Tuesday evening. It's the 23rd of August. We're getting ominously close to Christmas, whatever that is. And we've got quite an evening lined up for you, as usual. And as always, I'm joined by Jason Holmes. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Andy. How are you?
I'm good, mate. Yeah, it's been a bit of an up and down time. I've spent a few days away with friends. So battery's nice and refreshed in that respect. But a lot of confusing information coming in from all directions. So let's hope that tonight's guest can make a bit of sense out of it all for us. But before we go any further, we had a few technical issues again today. That's why we missed last Thursday's show after Andrew Johnson unfortunately had to pull out at the last minute, but Tony stepped in and Tony's hosting for us tonight. So thanks for that, Tony. Big help, mate. But on with the show. Tonight we're joined by two of our favourite guests. It's Paul and Lisa from the Sirius Report. Evening, guys.
Good evening.
Good evening. How are you, bud? No, don't worry. It's fine.
We're all good, apart from Jason coughing one of his lungs up over there.
Yeah,
it's kind of got CBD oil.
Not very pleasant.
No, so Lisa, I believe you're going to kick things off for us tonight.
Yeah, well, obviously, I'm going to talk a little bit about the website, which, been going for a few weeks now. And we've basically just been putting up articles. We've got about 45 articles now, I think.
Okay, tell us the website. What's the website address so that people can go and check it out?
The address is thesiriusreport.com. I believe the link will be below the podcast as well. So yeah, basically, it's going quite well.
How long has it been going, Lisa?
Sorry?
How long has it been going? How long has it been live and active? Give us some sort of perspective on how you're growing over there.
I think it was the 21st of July we went kind of live, so to speak.
Yeah.
So it's about a month. You've had the website live for about a month, and how's it looking? I've been over there, and it looks great. And some of the information on there is the articles are well written and the erudite, and they keep your interest anyway. So, what sort of numbers have you been racking up?
We've had so far almost 22,000 reads in total.
Oh.
So going quite well, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, we've had almost 12,000 visitors. So.
And from 76 countries, I think, was the last time we checked. It may be more. There's some countries in there I've never heard of, but
might be an idea, Paul, if a few of the visitors told their friends, because it seems like you've got 2 or 3 people from every country on the planet, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I think predominantly there's a lot in the US, UK. There's Australia, Canada, quite a lot in Mexico actually. There's quite a few in Saudi Arabia, interestingly.
I think we even had one in Tanzania.
Yeah, Tanzania, quite a few in the Africa as the continent. So yeah, it's been spread all over the place.
So what's the mission statement for the website? What are your plans? What do you want to bring to the? I mean, it's already there's plenty of websites in there that are bringing different news and different reviews and articles and things like that. How's yours going to be different?
Well, what we're trying to do, we kind of want to be this independent news website so we can give an alternative perspective on mainstream news. And obviously that's the political, economic, and geopolitics. We've also extended the website to health and spirituality, so we're extending a little bit in terms of the remit as opposed to the website. As opposed to the Facebook page, which was just economics and geopolitics. And we feel what we're doing is we're taking news that's coming out and actually putting the context in which you don't get in mainstream media. And given what we've done over the last year or so on the radio shows. Then it's on the Facebook page and now on the website. What we're trying to do is get to that cutting edge of saying, well, this is what's actually going on, as opposed to just giving people some blanket statement, which obviously mainstream news does without the context. And that's where we feel we can exploit something that perhaps, other websites don't, and perhaps, certainly the mainstream media doesn't.
Mm-hmm. And have you got a number of writers on board, or is it just primarily a two-man team, shall we say? Obviously, notwithstanding you, Lisa, but you're just a two-man team, or are you inviting people to write articles for your site?
Well, for the moment, it's just the two of us, but we are looking at maybe bringing in some other people, as guest writers or guest posts, I guess. So,
if people want to, and they feel there's something they like to write about. I mean, obviously, there's certain things like we'd like to, we did the inclined bed therapy with Andrew, and that was excellent. We've had a lot of interesting response to that, so we can engage with people in different areas and do some interviews with them, and we may do podcasts with them in the future, or it may just be written interviews with kind of Q&A like we've done so far. So there's scope to kind of develop that in the future as well.
That's excellent. So I know your Facebook group, the Sirius Report, is entirely centered on financial and geopolitical matters, but you diversify quite a lot on the website, don't you? What kind of things are you covering on there?
Well, obviously, additionally, there's the health and spirituality. So, I mean, so far in the health thing, we've done obviously inclined bed therapy. Lisa wrote the article about Lady Comp, which is obviously the natural kind of hormone-free contraceptive method. And there was a little article about this health booster that we were led to believe the elite's being given. That was just an example. And then, in terms of obviously on the spirituality, Lisa wrote an article about, I'll get my teeth in here, Rosicrucianism. And then obviously she wrote one about what's called the Gnostic creation myth about the goddess Sophia. So we can develop those things. The health thing can include all manner of subjects. It's a very wide remit, as is spirituality. And we'd like to get more articles and work on that more as well. And obviously if we can get interviews with people in areas that they have a specialty in, then that'd be excellent to put that on the site to diversify it. So it's not just a kind of economics and geopolitical sort of bent to the website.
Yeah, and there's definitely more articles to come in those categories. It's just I've been quite busy recently doing the kind of behind the scenes stuff for the website, but there's definitely a lot more to come.
Yeah, but also you did an enormous job on that. The 6 parts for the Rothschild dynasty historical timeline. That was a huge piece of work. I mean, the raw data was enormous, and to break all that down took quite a long time to do so. And that's been very well received by people as well. Thousands of reads for all the 6 parts to that. So that was an excellent piece of work Lisa did for that.
Yes, it's a very extensive 6-part article, that one. I have been playing through it, and there's a heck of a lot of information in there. It's a great article, well written, Lisa. Thanks.
Well, I actually took most of the content from a PowerPoint presentation, which I think was written by Andrew Hitchcock. So I kind of took that, edited it a little bit. It was, I think, 437 slides, so I couldn't include all the information, but I kind of took the most important parts and obviously put them in the articles and added some pictures and everything.
So the message is get yourself over to Sirius. Is it the Sirius Report or Sirius Report? Is it just
the Sirius Report?
Yeah, the Sirius Report.
Right. So get yourself over to the Sirius Report and bookmark it and keep checking out. I know you're posting when you've updated the website. You do post on your Facebook page as well. So get onto the Facebook page, Sirius Report. So let's get down to brass tacks. What's one other thing. Sorry.
Yeah, one thing we just wanted to mention was the fact we obviously talked in the past about going to have a subscription-based content. and we kind of feel we need to do that because we need to make it pay its way. If we're going to do this properly, and I'm not saying we haven't had the right attitude to it so far, but if we're going to do this the way we really want to do it, then we need to find a way of financing. I know people will say, well, I don't like paying for things, and that's fine if people don't want to pay for it. That's we don't have a problem with that. But in order to do this the way we really want to do it, it needs to become a full-time job. And that in itself, I mean, we're already spending a huge amount of time, and my argument would always be, well, would anyone here do a job for nothing? Everyone has to pay bills, et cetera, and we kind of come up with a rough, plan as to how we want to structure a kind of subscription-based content, and Lisa can just go through that very quickly and give people an idea as to what we're intending to do and what you'll get in terms of the subscription on a monthly basis.
Yeah, so basically what it's going to be is there's going to be reports released twice a week. There'll be one on Wednesday and one on Saturday. They will obviously be sort of detailed updates on, what's going on currently and with regards to financial and geopolitical stuff. Sort of Ben Fulford or Jim Willey style, if you will. Then we'll continue doing the articles like we're doing now. They will obviously be included in the subscription. And all that content will be released 2 months afterwards, and that'll be for free. So obviously what people will be getting sort of the same stuff, but only after 2 months.
Yeah, so basically all the subscription content will then become available to everyone on the free site, as it were. That's the plan.
Yeah,
because if we release it too soon, people will say, well, what's the point in paying for it?
So if you really want the all the current stuff, the really up-to-date stuff, then that'll obviously be subscription-based. Then we will also occasionally do things like ebooks, which you can then also purchase individually if you don't have a membership. And they'll be free for the members. And we might also occasionally do some podcasts, and that'll be members only. And of course, we'll continue doing the radio shows like this one, like we are now, basically. So that's it for the content. Then as for the price, the monthly subscription will be $6.99 a month. And then obviously, as for other currencies, that'll be subject to the exchange rates. We're using... So
we're actually pricing it in dollars, so we're going to be affected by that currency as well.
Yeah, because obviously we need to convert it to pounds.
Mm-hmm. But we feel with the reports we do twice weekly and all the articles that we're not going to say exactly how many, but we'll write as many as we possibly can on all manner of subjects as well. And, writing ebooks and that throughout the course of the year and podcasts, we think people get an awful lot of pertinent information on a monthly basis. And it's up to people if they want to subscribe or don't want to. But obviously, we're not going to put the information out on the free section of the website for maybe 2 months, because that way people will then have to, subscribe to get the current information, which I don't think it's unreasonable to charge. We scouted around to see what other people charge, and we are actually undercutting some people, and we feel people get an awful lot more content from us. And I think, our track record is good. We've done pretty well in the last 12 months to say the way things are. We've skirted around a lot of the issues that we felt were irrelevant, and I think we made the right decision to do that. So hopefully people will be supportive of going forward doing that.
And also people will be able to pay via PayPal and credit cards.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something for in the future. This is not happening at the moment, is it? I mean, you're not doing this at the moment.
No, it's not live yet, but we're looking at making it go live as quickly as possible. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, by the way, but obviously we've looked into the plugins that we need to put in on the back end for the website. So, and then we'll have to do a bit of testing and make sure it works and people don't get billed every 5 minutes or something.
Yeah. So obviously there'll be an extra sort of premium content page on the website where people can log in and read all their subscription stuff.
And I mean, I think what we're offering is an awful lot of information, and the point is, the more people who, I know it's just probably a statement the obvious, but the more people who subscribe, the more we can really turn it into a business, and we can maybe start to employ people to do things. Because we really, it may sound like a grandiose idea, but I'd really like to make this grow into something very big in the future, and how we'd all like to see news presented, not just the facts, but the context. What's the reality behind this? What do we really think this means, and what is the wider, broader perspective of what a particular article actually means? And I think that's something that we know is hugely lacking. And I think it's also lacking in a lot of the alternative media as well. And if we can extend it to other areas, maybe include other things other than spirituality and health, etc., in the future, then all the better. But for it to be as successful as you want to be, it has to start to be put on a financial footing. Otherwise, we can't both spend the time we're spending doing all this for nothing. It's just impossible. And I'm not expecting to make millions out of anything ridiculous like that. We're very modest people. We don't have extravagant lives or anything like that, and it's just enough to pay our way and to be able to make a real effort to be successful with it.
That's good to hear, Paul. Also, I forgot to mention earlier, we have actually got a link permanently on our website to Paul's new website, and that is, if you go to the top of the website and click the links banner, and there's a series of links to people we've had on the show and linking to, and the Sirius Report is there. And there is, if you click on the photograph there, it will take you to the new site, SiriusReport.com. So, moving on, Paul. What have we got new for August?
Right. Well, I guess we need to kind of take a bit of a sideways, backwards step for a second, and kind of look at when we spoke originally of all these alliances that will be formed in the future. We talked about this 12 months ago, and I think what we've seen in recent weeks, let's take Turkey as a great example of this, where Turkey was at loggerheads with Russia. It was clearly involved with ISIS in terms of oil shipments, providing arms, allowing ISIS terrorists, which is exactly what they are, over the border into Syria and causing all kind of mayhem in Syria. And then we had the aborted or failed coup, which was definitely a CIA operation. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Russia tipped Turkey off, and suddenly Turkey have done this huge 180, and they're signing trade agreements with Russia. They are now actually attacking ISIS targets in northern Syria. They're preventing ISIS terrorists getting over the border. Yeah, there's some ideological differences still between Russia and Turkey, but they're ironing them out. We've seen Turkey do the 180 flip, and we all spoke in the past of them being a key swing nation in not just in terms of the Middle East and Europe, but in a more global context. So that was a huge change. We've then seen now how Iran is letting Russia use their air bases to launch strikes in Syria. That's a recent development in the last week or so. And it's clear, obviously, now China is starting to say we're offering military support, logistics, and other help to Syria. And what we're now seeing is the birth of a new alliance, for want of a better word, but certainly the alliance is China, Russia, Iran. I would certainly start to include Turkey, but we have to be a little bit tentative about that. But certainly Turkey has an involvement, which is just standing up to the US hegemony of the Middle East, saying you're no longer going to be doing this anymore. This is the end. And this alliance is a multipolar alliance. It's not a nation dictating, as the US has dictated policy in the Middle East and everywhere else in the world. That is a huge change, and it's a big indication of how the world's going to be in the future, where when a nation has a problem, there's going to be an alliance of nations that will go in and deal with it. We started to see that where in Iraq, the Iranians have been going in, trying to deal with the problems there, as well as Russian involvement. The Chinese are also covertly involved there as well. And this has been a big, huge change. We'll start to see movements into Afghanistan as well, where Russia is certainly starting to offer assistance there to remove the problems that West has caused. We've seen in the last week where Russia is starting to work with Saudi Arabia, and so are the Chinese, and that's another example of a nation that will flip east, for want of a better word. And we're seeing the whole geopolitical map of the Middle East being redrawn in a spectacular way, and it's a big indication of how the world, as I said, is going to change in the future. So that is a massive development we've seen in a very, very short space of time. And now, of course, we're just seeing where actually the US have now, from what I understand, been cooperating with the Russians to work in terms of removing terrorist targets in Syria. You would never have believed that would ever have happened, even a short few weeks ago. So there's another interesting development where we're seeing these big geopolitical changes in that region. I think that's a huge development that is very important because, of course, the cabal's game was to redraw the map of the Middle East. And a lot of people talk about all these things that are important, and I'm not trivializing, and we kind of spoke this in the 1 hour show we did, but this is the reality of what the changes are. This is the big changes that are needed. Yes, these other things will have importance in another context, but it's always been about this. All the rest of the things, it's not relevant at this time. And I think it's muddied the waters a lot. It's confused people. They've been expecting these other things to happen, and they haven't happened. And the proof of the pudding is, we've heard things for 3 or 4 years. When have they happened? They just simply haven't happened. Or people do 180s and reinvent themselves and say something else, and it still doesn't happen. What we've talked about for the last 12 months is happening. We've explained how things would come to pass. We said Turkey would be a swing nation. We'll also see Japan do it in the future. We know Germany is beginning to do it, although a bit more tentatively. And we can talk a bit about Germany because there was obviously an interesting development, but we'll park that for now. But I think that's been one of the big fundamental changes. And I'd get people say to me, well, all these changes are happening in the Middle East. What's that got to do with Europe? What's that got to do with the US? Well, it has everything to do with, because this world, we're not islands, we're not isolated. It's an important development because it's a clear indication that the cabal is failing and failing rapidly and very, very quickly. So, and they have to fail on a global scale. They can't just fail on a couple of nations and the world changes. It has to be a big global change, and that's what we're starting to see.
Yeah, it has been interesting. I want to focus just a little bit on what's been going on in Brazil. I know the Olympics have been going on, haven't they, over there? Now, I think we've spoke about this before, that this was supposed to try and skint them, I suppose, if for want of a better word. Do you think that it's all gone to plan for the cabal, or do you think that it's not quite gone to plan, because there seems to be a huge gap in the funding that they've seemed to have taken from the Paralympics to prop up the regular Olympics?
Sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, do you think that how did the cabal's plan regarding the Olympics? How did it go?
Well, as ever, there was all this talk, and we kept hearing there's going to be some big event happen. The cabal are going to do something at the Olympics, and I said they'll never do anything at the Olympics. It will never happen. And of course, it didn't happen. Surprise, surprise. No, I mean, the Olympics as an event, just from a sporting perspective, and it was a success. Clearly, I think Britain was very happy with its return in medals, but there was a lot of controversy in it. But we'll skirt over the problem with the Russian athletes and the way American athletes were treating them was despicable. But anyway, that's a separate issue. But you could see this in terms of from a spectator perspective, the stadiums were empty.
Yeah,
I mean, there was the people just simply can't afford to buy the tickets. I think my mum said to me, apparently on the last day they let everyone in for free, which is why the stadium was heaving with people. because it was the only way, I suppose, on closing ceremony day to convince the world that, it was a success. I think financially it probably hasn't been a success. I mean, given the cost of staging it, no doubt we'll never get to the bottom of what the exact cost was, but it'll be probably 2 or 3 times what the official figure is. So financially, I don't think it was successful. But in a broader sense, obviously, Brazil's got some huge political problems. There's definitely a lot of cabal meddling going on in the nation. And obviously, there's the impeachment hearing coming up, I think, very soon, which... so basically, Brazil's economically in a huge mess. I mean, it's probably not that too dissimilar almost to Venezuela. It's not quite that bad. But as we've seen with Venezuela, Russia and China are coming to their aid. And I think you'll see Russia and China will come to the aid of Brazil when it really matters. They may, we know they're part of the BRICS alliance, so they obviously have a vested interest to help them in that regard. But I think, we'll start to see some change in Brazil. But like ever, they're always mindful of not treading on everyone's toes. And rather like Venezuela, they've come in at the 9th hour when Venezuela's in an absolute mess and starting to try and help them and prop them up. And but what's gone on in Venezuela is absolutely horrendous. And it's an example of what happens to any nation when their currency collapses. And so people talk about the US and said before about their currency collapsing, i.e. the dollar, and ending up with a devalued currency. It may sound absolutely impossible, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, but the US could end up like Venezuela, and people will say that could never happen. Well, there's a risk it could happen. But I would suspect, and this is the irony, if it really gets that bad and we see all the huge changes which we expect to happen, don't even be surprised to see Russia and China come in and try and do something to stabilize things in the US, which also would sound incredibly impossible to believe. But I wouldn't rule anything out with regards to any nation now going forward.
Well, also, the next Olympics is in Japan, and you mentioned Japan earlier on as being somewhere of interest where interesting things are going on. So do you think that they're probably going to try and do the same thing in Japan as essentially they have done to Brazil? I mean, Brazil's people are going to be picking up this bill for the Olympics. It's the people that are going to bear the brunt of that. So do you think they're going to do the same thing in Japan? And do you think that's the reason why Japan was chosen?
I don't know. Well, it's difficult to know, but by 2020, the world won't be anything like it is now, or it won't even be like it is in 2018 or 17. So I don't think it really will have the relevance. I mean, when the Olympics were chosen for Tokyo, maybe there was a different perspective, but as the world changes rapidly, it's not going to be the way it is. I think, the whole way the Olympics is ran by the next one will be possibly very different. It certainly won't be from a cabal perspective, that's for sure, but time will tell in that regard. But Japan's absolutely financially wrecked, which, they've had more QE than the rest of the world combined. They've got negative interest rate policy that's destroying the nation. And I put an article up which was talking about the problems. I haven't got onto the interest rate one. I haven't written one yet, but I wrote one about the bond markets and why they can't really, whatever they do, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. And really, it's the same with interest rates. Negative and zero interest rate destroys economies, but if they try and raise them, they'll wreck and destroy the economy. And I'm going to put an article out future on the site which will talk about this and explain, like we did with the bond markets, very simply why. They're damned if they do and damned if they don't, and hence why the financial system's wrecked. But Japan's economy is destroyed. And that's the reality. And they're showing hints of rotating east. They've had talks with Russia, and there's one minute think there might be a bit of a thawing in relations with China, and then it gets a bit muddied again. But I think ultimately, soon enough, the Japanese and the Chinese will resolve their differences, but it's going to take time. But it's going to happen eventually. And they're another kind of key kind of swing nation because they're effectively just a Bush enclave and have been since the end of World War II. When, ironically, of course, we had Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were destroyed with nuclear weapons after they'd already surrendered. That's part of history that perhaps not everybody's aware of.
That's right. So much of history is either glossed over or changed retrospectively. In fact, most history books are they actually worth reading now, because the more you dig into it, the more you find out that the narrative we're being given is completely false.
Oh, yeah, indeed. And I think the rewriting of history to the correct version of history is going to be quite interesting. And I think, there's just a few of the points that Lisa put in the Rothschild dynasty article just give people a whole different perspective as to who controls what. I mean, one where they took over financial control of the Vatican. Now, everyone always assumes the Vatican's the one controlling everything. Well, actually, they're not. And, there's a lot of examples where people say things enough times, it becomes a reality, or it becomes a belief mechanism, or a belief process, or system. And unfortunately, we're seeing a risk of that happening in the alternative media, where people are striving to seek the truth, that some of these truisms that have been said for a long time simply aren't true. And it's not a criticism of anybody in particular. But, I'm aware of the fact that quite about 2 or 3 years ago, there was information put out to various sources through various channels to see where it went, to ascertain if anybody in the alternative community had some links with cabal-type people. And it's thrown up some very interesting channels of information going here, there, and everywhere. And it's quite interesting to see some people who, from my perspective, and I'm not going to name them because it's irrelevant, who are not as trustworthy as perhaps people believe. And it's not necessarily anybody, by the way, that people will jump to conclusions and go, oh, it must be so-and-so or so-and-so. It's not. It's far more subtle than that even. But that kind of problem, that there are people in the alternative community who aren't what they say they are. That much is self-evident. But anyway, we'll park that because that's an irrelevance, really. But
we've got an interesting question from Patrick in the chat room, and I've got to read it out because I don't think I've heard anyone ask this particular question during the show. And Patrick's wondering who is pulling the Rothschild strings, if indeed there is anyone. Any thoughts on that one, Paul?
Well, do you know what? No, I don't think there is anyone pulling the strings. I mean, we're back to this thing of, is there some high overarching hierarchy that controls the Rothschilds? And we kind of touched that in the hour show about this belief of these higher forces that control everything. Now, if you look at the history, in really pure, crude sense of the word, the Rothschilds were ruthless operators who saw an opportunity to control the financial world. And they actually had the intelligence to do it, unfortunately, and they succeeded. And they had a lot of failures along the way, but they kept going, and they controlled the financial system. So no, I don't think they do have any controls yet. There are disagreements certainly between the Bushes, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and other dynasties within their ilk. But no, I mean, essentially, no, I don't believe anyone does control. I think part of the reason the whole empire is now collapsing is the younger generations don't want anything to do with it. They're like, we've had enough of this. Yeah, the family may have ruled the roost for 250 years, and despite setbacks along the way. But I think they've had enough, and they just don't want to be part of it anymore. And that, as much as anything, if you want to change the world, some of the people who we regard as the big architects of the very world we don't want to see have to change their perspective. And we've seen that it's not, it isn't just about waking humanity up to the insanity. There have to be people within the system itself who want to change, and they have changed, and they are changing it. We're seeing, Erdogan's a great example in Turkey. Would I personally trust him particularly? Not entirely. No, of course not, because of his history. But there's no doubt in the last few weeks he's changed his perspective on things. We're going to see a lot more of that happen as time goes by, because a lot of these puppets are just puppets. They probably didn't even realize the extent of what was being done to them. Erdogan's a great example. Did he ever imagine that the US would try and stage a coup to remove him? That was the last thing in his mind, but when that happened, it was a big wake-up call for him. So we're going to see a lot of people flipping from one perspective to a different perspective. But no, I don't see any evidence that anyone controls the Rothschilds. I mean, yeah, there's the Draco thing, which we're not going to go into, and all this kind of thing. And so from my perspective, well, is that a reality? I've not seen any evidence. I've heard a lot of people talk about it. Fine. Well, no, I don't think there's anyone controlling the Rothschilds.
Okay, you mentioned Erdogan again there. Something that really puzzled me. Turkey seemed to be developing closer and closer ties with Russia, and then all of a sudden, when that plane got shot down over the Syrian border, suddenly they did a complete about face, even though they were already buying Russian weapon systems at that time, and now we've seen them swinging back. Is that just US cabal manipulation? Do you think there's something a bit stranger going on there, or any ideas?
No, I think it was just US cabal pressure. I mean, because obviously we know Russia was doing exactly what the cabal doesn't want in Syria and in a broader context now in Iraq, Afghanistan, and I mean, it just another point that's just come up in the last week is that Russia is basically telling Israel and Palestine, you're going to sit down and resolve these matters and deal with them, and we're not having any more excuses about it. And I actually suspect we will start to see some developments on that. It'll be a slow process, but it's kind of indicative of what Russia are doing, and the US cabal, we're terrified of developments, and there's no doubt. I suspect they were behind the shooting down. It was certainly an act of provocation, which Russia didn't obviously rise to the bait. And that was possibly a slight turning point in the process. But certainly for Russia to tip off Erdogan and say, you know what, the US are launching a coup and they want you out, but we're giving you warning it's going to happen. And then, of course, he managed to avoid the coup, and it fell apart, and he's still the leader. And obviously there's this huge purge going on. And there's a lot of criticism, and I accept the fact of this purge and who's being purged, but it kind of gives you an indication of the extent of how a network of people will work inside a nation for a third party, i.e. the cabal. And this is something, if you look at a nation of the size of Turkey, just extrapolate what that must be in a nation like Russia and China, and what the work they've had to do to get rid of the cabal influences in their own nation. And yeah, there are still some NGOs and other organisations and people working inside these countries who are trying to destabilise things. But they've largely removed the major threats, and there's some sort of lesser threats that are still there, but they're not really a serious problem anymore. But that's how big the infiltration is in these nations. They infiltrate everywhere. The sole purpose that gives them that measure of control and ability to be able to affect the changes they want to affect.
Mm-hmm. And the big news that I've been noticing trumpeted about everywhere in the last week, you briefly touched on it earlier, I wondered if this might be time to bring it up, is the suggestion that the German government are about to tell their citizens they need to stockpile food and water.
Yeah, well, I wrote an article, and I think we can talk about that. It was announced over the weekend that Germany was intending to advise its citizens to stockpile food and water, and I believe medication and all manner of other things in the event of an unspecified catastrophe or event happening. And apparently it came from the Interior Ministry that they confirmed that apparently the plan was being discussed tomorrow, I believe, with a view to presenting the findings that same day, but I guess that's open to speculation whether on the timings of delivery. And yeah, it basically said stockpile enough drinking water to last 5 to 10 days, and that people prepare appropriately for a development that could threaten their existence and can't be categorically ruled out in the future. And it suggests that the plan will need to offer support for the armed services of the nation in there's such an event happening. And it said that they stated that the Parliamentary Committee had originally commissioned this civil defence strategy back in 2012. So I kind of went away and thought about this, and I went, okay, well, we know that the German Defence Minister recently announced Merkel's wonderful 9-point plan to fight terrorism within the German borders. And that included allowing the army to be involved in response to possible terrorist attacks. It etc., tightening weapons laws and increasing the exchange of intelligence with the US, and it's a bit of a strange decision to exchange it with the US anyway. And also they wanted to have the potential involvement of, now we've got to be careful, it's the Bundeswehr, I think, which is, they're the armed forces of Germany and their civil administration and procurement authority, and they're all supposed to fight against terrorism. And if you look at the spate of these little terrorist attacks, and I don't mean that trivially, I mean literally in the context that they were on an individual, an isolated basis, not in terms of anyone dying is hugely regrettable, as we know, and they're being dotted around Germany. I think it was in Munich, Reutlingen and Ansbach and places like that, and Nuremberg and Berlin. So the obvious context will be is, well, let's look at this, and immediately, of course, everyone will jump to the opinion, oh, it must be related to terrorist attacks in Germany. Well, I then went away and thought about it and went, well, in the context of such a threat, if we historically look at terrorist attacks that have been carried out in modern history, when has there ever been a requirement for it to have a terrorist attack that required people to stockpile food and water? I mean, it just doesn't happen. They're obviously, usually individual attacks that happen randomly dispersed. They're not concentrated attacks on that scale. And people have said to me, well, they could suddenly unleash, hundreds of ISIS targets or ISIS terrorists and start creating mayhem. Well, if that's true, well, then it still wouldn't require people to have stockpile food and water. And then, of course, another possibility would be a conventional war. Well, that's not going to happen. I mean, then it would lead to a nuclear war, and despite everyone saying that's going to happen, no, it's absolutely not going to happen. So
I'm just wondering, Paul, whether this particular bit of advice was a psychological attack on the German people, because I would imagine there would still be people around who could remember or who heard stories from the parents from around about the wartime. And I would imagine before war was declared, there would have been advice to stock up on food and water. Now, I don't know whether, if you remember, we had this period, I think it was around about 2012, where things from the war started popping up, particularly those keep calm and carry on posters that were from the Second World War. They just started to pop up. Now, I'm just wondering whether it's just a psychological attack on the people there, just to sort of remind them of the country's history and what they've been through before, and perhaps to for them to sort of fall in line and not want any discourse regarding Europe, because there has been talk about a Grexit, a Gurksit, I would imagine it is, for a referendum in Germany. So I just wondered whether that, because it's rather ambiguous just to say stock up on food and water, then instantly people are asking why.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a possibility, but no, I don't think so. I mean, what I know from the German military and the Secret Service in Germany, they do not take up orders from the cabal. They've been very much not supportive of the cabal. They're not going to start riling or allow the nation to be riled in that way. And they also made some reference to climatic or kind of some similar event which could render all essential services inoperable. And once again, to be the kind of level we're talking about, stockpiling food and water would be irrelevant, because if it was that severe, there would literally have to be, that's sounding too crass, a tsunami which would destroy the whole of Germany, which is just not going to happen. I mean, I'm not tempting fate here, it just simply won't happen. So it left me with one conclusion. What would be the most likely cause for a population to stockpile essentials? And the meltdown of the banking system in any nation would trigger precisely that event. We know for a fact that the financial system collapses, the distribution network collapses, so food would not be available, the water supply would go off, everything, and no, you couldn't have any financial transaction. So effectively, a nation would grind to a halt. Now, would it grind to a halt indefinitely? No. Would it grind to a halt for a period of time? Yes, 5 to 10 days is a possibility. What we do know is, and it's abundantly clear, the systemic risk unfolding across the Western financial system is gathering pace. I mean, I said on Facebook page about 6 weeks ago. I gave it about 8 weeks or so that we may have systemic crisis. Maybe a little bit out in terms of timescales, but it's possible it could happen in the next month or so. I'm not saying it will, but it's a distinct possibility. I did, ironically, actually 2 days before, get some information that the German financial system, because of how the European Union hangs together, is in big trouble. So that may have just been a coincidence that this announcement comes out, but I do think if we stack up all the possibilities, it would certainly suggest to me it was a more financial meltdown. And of course, the last thing they're going to say to people is, do you know what, we think it's the financial system, because you know what would happen within 5 minutes, every bank would have no money left in its ATMs and people would go into blind panic. And the idea of saying that people need to work and cooperate with the military in such a scenario, absolutely they would have to. Yes, there is the flip side that says, well, they could just be doing that to sucker people in because there's some idea there's going to be this grand cabal takeover and they're going to instigate all the usual stuff. Well, it's just, we heard this so many times, it never happens and it never will happen. The German people are not going to suddenly tolerate some martial law imposed or something where the military start act draconian and they're just going to stand there and take this. They simply won't take it. I actually think it might be a genuine attempt to foresee a problem that's going to happen. So then the German people can say, well, okay, we were kind of warned about this. I don't think it's led to any great panic in Germany. I don't think people they're not that way inclined, but I actually do suspect it's more related to the financial system, which would be a clear catalyst why people would need to do that. I mean, it is a statement to the obvious from my perspective that would be the scenario where it would happen, not this idea that suddenly all these ISIS terrorist cells are going to spring up in Germany and they're going to take the country over. I mean, it just simply isn't going to happen. There's not that many of them. And again, the whole ethos of immigration's been totally blown out of proportion. I know there's been problems, no doubt about it. I'm not trivializing it, but it's not as widespread as people would imagine it is. And how many people have in terms of immigration, I think it's, 1.5 million? The German population's 80 million.
Yeah.
And yet we kind of get the impression that they're running amok in every city in Germany. Well, it just can't simply be possible. So, and there is certain factions within political parties and France is the same, who want to make as much political capital out of immigration as they possibly can, because it suits them to, for future elections to get elected on that mandate. Yes, there are problems, but I don't think it's as bad as that. Despite anyone who's lost any member of their family or friends in terrorist attacks that have happened in Germany, I'm not trivialising that. It's a shocking thing that's happened, and we can never trivialise any such single attack. But I think in the context of this, it just doesn't fit the bill. That's exactly what they're referring to. And some climatic event or some tsunami happens or something that wipes out all the gas supply, the electric and water. Can we really see that happening? No, I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. We've got another question here, Paul, from the chat room, and it's regarding the subject of nuclear war. Excuse me. Saying that's absolutely not going to happen. How can you be sure of that, Paul? Fair question, I think.
Yeah, it is a fair question. Well, I've said it for years, and I've said it a year ago. Well, look, the bottom line is in all situations where if the US had the balance of power in their favour now, in terms of, then the likelihood of a nuclear war would be greater. But we know for a fact that the Russians have technology that's light years ahead. We've seen it where they've demonstrated that Donald Cook was a great example of that. They disabled all the electrics, and we've seen them do flybys right under the nose of the US to say, look, we've got technology, you can't even see us. They've now got this plane that, we call it a glide, that can go at 7 Mach or something like that, and no radar can see it, and it can be loaded with tactical nuclear weapons, and they did warn the Americans, look, if you want a war, and the Russians are like this, they'll never start a war, but I'll tell you what, they'll end it. And when they end it, it doesn't end up pretty for the opposition. And as the Second World War can testify to that. And they're quite happy. They've said to the Americans, if you really seriously want a world war, this is the deal. We'll obliterate and destroy your country in 15 minutes. You won't even know we've been there. And you'll be lucky if we have a scratch on our knee. So if that's what you want, you start a war, we'll end it, and it won't be pretty for you. And that's why the balance of power shifted so much towards Russia and the Eastern Alliance militarily that it just will never happen. And this is why the US have backed out of Syria and with a tail between their legs. Yeah, there's still notion there, but they're not ruining the roost. In days gone by, they would have tried all manner of things, but they're backing out of things. They've really backed out of Ukraine now and left it in an unholy mess as well. I mean, but they've essentially not achieved their objectives. And that's the other thing, they're failing all over the world in terms of their key objectives. So that's why I just don't see it ever happening. And also, the US military, none of these people, do they really want a war that's going to end up with obliterating half of the planet, and unfortunately their half of the planet? Absolutely not. So, no, I have no shred of doubt we will never have a nuclear war.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people that I feel that way as well. I think they value the real estate so much to have a nuclear war. And we got another question in the chat room from Susie Q. Now, Susie's asking, it says, Paul, what do you feel are the odds of the euro disappearing before the yuan becomes part of the SDR basket on October the 1st?
The SDR basket, where do I start with that? No, I don't think it will disappear before October the 1st. But I mean, yes, the euro, the eurozone could collapse. Will we see the death of the euro in overnight? Probably not in that scenario. But I think the seeds of destruction of the euro are in train now. But I think it's a good point to talk about the SDR, because I have a particular kind of problem with that, and it's simply this, that the SDR is what I call a basket case currency. I mean, and we're led to believe that this is the future of the new financial paradigm. Yes, China's joined it, and everyone goes, oh, well, China's playing ball with the IMF, they're playing ball with the cabal. No, they're absolutely not. Do they think the SDR has any mileage in the long term? No. The SDR is it lasts a month or two or three. At that point, it'd be a miracle. The rationale why the Chinese will have joined it is because they see it as an opportunity to say, well, actually, we're going to have a big stake in this. But you know what I wouldn't be surprised if they push to have a sixth currency added in. It's called gold. And they may use it as a way of then of subverting things to say, well, actually, dollar worthless, yen worthless, pound worthless. All these basket case currencies. We've got a gold-backed currency. This is the future, and that's the sideways door of moving in, of having a gold-backed yuan, for want of a better word, as a reserve currency. Now, whether that will ever materialise either is an entirely different matter. But the SDR thing, Jim Rickards has gone on about it forever and a day, that it was the future of the financial system. Well, I just don't see it, because it is, as I say, it's a basket case currency. So are we really seriously saying, well, if we throw the yuan in, it will save the day and all the other currencies will survive as they are now? It's just not possible. So I think the SDR thing's a bit of a hot air, but I suspect the Chinese will use it in some way to benefit themselves. And as the saying always goes, China always has a plan. We just don't always know what they're doing. But I think the rationale for joining the SDR is not how people suspect it will be, and I think they will look to adopt the sixth currency, which will be gold, and it might be a backdoor way of them issuing in the gold-backed yuan, and that will be the standard for the future, and it will depose, obviously, the US dollar.
Oh, we've got another one from Susie Q, all the way over from Texas, and apparently they're having a heat wave over there. It's scorching hot, 100 degrees for the last 5 days. We could do 100 degrees here, couldn't we, Jace?
Well, it's supposed to be a heat wave, this, isn't it? I think what they do now is, if the weather's going to be normal for the time of year, they decide to call it a heat wave. And in the winter, when it's going to be normal for the time of year, they're going to call it a storm or a... It's ridiculous.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Anyway, back to Susie's question.
Sorry.
Paul, what about the rumours of backing all the world's currencies with gold overnight and probably before October 1st?
Well, they are. Well, I've not heard that that's going to happen by that date. Could it happen? Well, anything's possible. But I just file it under speculation. And yeah, there's once again words of this. Yeah, the rationale why this story is coming about is because China joined the SDR basket on the 1st of October. That's why there's all this idea it's all going to happen by that date. It's just kind of a logic that I don't share. I'm not saying it won't happen by that date, but I think that's the rationale where that's coming from, and I don't see that to be relevant to the discussion of whether that date's going to come and to pass, and we will see that happen. Yeah, I mean, the whole basis of the financial system should be that currencies are going to be gold-backed or asset-backed. I think Mexico will argue we want to back our peso with silver, and rightly so. They've got a huge amount of silver assets. Other nations might want to back their currency, with other assets. But yeah, essentially the idea is to have gold-backed currencies, and then how do we kind of find an equilibrium between currencies to do that? That's the interesting question. But I don't think from a Chinese perspective this is anywhere near as mature from their angle as it is apparently from the alternative community, where they believe all these things are going to come to pass. Never seen any evidence the Chinese see that as happening, within the near future. But that doesn't mean the cabal doesn't go due south and the financial system doesn't crash and collapse or anything else. Or maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But Chinese aren't working on the basis of that. China is definitely waiting for the cabal and the Western financial system to implode. They just sat there going, you just keep doing what you're doing. We don't have to do anything. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to be seen to be the aggressor. And Russia's exactly the same. It's what they did in Ukraine. They just sat there and they've done nothing. And Ukraine is imploding all by itself. I mean, that's how they both operate. They're not going to interfere, because if they interfere, then they're handing the initiative to the cabal with the propaganda that they can extract from saying we have clear evidence. I mean, yeah, they've muted that Russia's involved in Ukraine, but no one believes it anymore, and no one even listens. So they've largely shut up on that angle because they know it's nonsense and people don't buy it anymore. But from a propaganda perspective, they'd love to have concrete evidence of Russia and China meddling in the Western financial system. So they will just let it collapse under its own weight, which it's doing rather well all by itself.
Okay, thanks for that, Paul. Now's about the time we usually have our musical break in the middle of the show. So if Tony's at the controls, we'll play a quick tune and we'll be back in just under 6 minutes. And welcome back to Raconteurs-news. This Tuesday evening, we're joined by Paul and Lisa of the Sirius Report, and we had a fascinating first hour. Before we start the second hour, Paul was mentioning about monetizing their site, and we haven't really monetized our site, but we've ask people if they can afford to make a donation. If they like what we're doing, then we'd be very grateful that, because up until those donations, we're entirely self-funded. So we do need a little bit of help to expand and grow and to improve what service we're offering. And I'd like to say an absolutely huge thank you to a certain person who'd like to remain anonymous, who sent a generous donation this week, and they passed a hat round among all their friends and got a few dollars here and a few dollars there. And to all those who contributed and to the person who sent it over to us, I'd like to say a massive thank you. It's really going to be helpful for RN moving forward. Anyway, back to Lisa and Paul. Where would you like to go in the second hour, Paul? Or Lisa, even?
Well, I suppose we've touched kind of the Middle East, and maybe we should talk a little bit about Europe and some of the interesting developments there. And I think we can start out actually with the UK itself, where our newly elected Prime Minister Theresa May has agreed that she has to meet with Vladimir Putin as soon as possible to discuss, a whole range of topics from the economy to terrorism, and definitely hinting that there is an urgent room for improvement in Saudi relations. And I think this is another clear example of the UK rotating east. We've talked in the past about them working with China on financial matters and all to do with currency swaps, and also a lot of trade agreements that were signed, although I noticed that Britain seems to have shot themselves in the foot over Hinkley because they've kind of backtracked on that, and the Chinese are absolutely livid about that. But anyway, we'll see what develops in that. Hinkley's obviously the nuclear power station. But it shows there's a desire to work with Russia, and I think you'll see Britain very slowly, very cautiously, but in a concerted way, will start to rotate east and work a lot more with Russia and China in the future. We've seen Italy's a great example of a nation that has done that. And I think it's kind of interesting on the back of that we've seen this week that Merkel, Hollande, and Renzi, obviously the Italian Prime Minister, who's now been included in the high-level European meetings. He's been invited to discuss. Apparently, it's all about having closer integration in Europe. No, it's actually about the fact that they realise the European Union's in big trouble, and what are they going to do about it? And the fact Renzi's involved is all to do with the fact of his relationship with Russia particularly, but also they're starting to develop better relations with China. So I think that's a kind of highly indicative of a big swing in development. We're still not seeing Germany being the swing nation on a Turkey kind of way, but we know for a fact Merkel's not part of the discussions, but there are huge ongoing meetings between Russia and Germany particularly, which is all about Germany swinging east, and which ultimately will mean Germany will leave the European Union, or the European Union will just dissolve anyway, etc. And obviously the end of the euro as well in that regard. So there's some sort of interesting developments we've seen with regards to the UK, but also the fact Italy now getting involved in these discussions with Hollande and Merkel, which they seem to regard themselves as the two major nations. I suspect Holland and Italy and other nations like Austria would beg to differ in that regard. But we're certainly seeing more and more evidence of a desire. Holland's a great example where they want to have a referendum. Germany also wants a referendum. And Italy, I think Renzi's ticket is, well, I'll give you a referendum, hoping he'll get re-elected on that basis. Well, he's taking a big chance in terms of what the outcome of that will be. But certainly the European Union's disintegrating and fragmenting, and we're increasingly seeing more and more evidence, particularly after the St. Petersburg conference, where there was a lot of European nations and companies wanting to trade with Russia like we've not seen before in many years. despite all these sanctions, and they're finding it kind of innovative ways of getting around these sanctions and being able to work with Russia in terms of trade agreements. So I think there are more significant developments. Europe's not quite as advanced as other nations, but we're certainly seeing increasing evidence that they are moving towards a more kind of, or less US-centric kind of way of handling things, and more of a, well, actually, we need to work with these nations going forward because this is the future of the world, where no matter what the cabal may believe otherwise. I do think we're starting to see that.
What do you make of Sarkozy throwing his hat back in the ring? Do you think that's the cabal trying to gain a little bit more control, a little bit of control back, or it seems weird, that one, to me?
Well, I think he's come out and said that if the French people want out of the European Union and it's their wish, then we have to go with that. So be it. Which a lot of people go, hang on, that's an absolutely outrageous comment for Sarkozy to make. Yeah, I mean, Sarkozy, you can argument can be the cabal look after themselves. Well, they didn't look after Sarkozy. I get the feeling he was regarded as a spent force and they wanted him out the way. And I think he's actually just a loose cannon now who doesn't care anymore, say what he says and believe what he believes. I don't think he's part of the cabal anymore in the sense of what he may have been in the past. So he's now at kind of liberty to say what he thinks, because as some people say, it's a populist kind of way of getting votes, because Le Pen's are saying she wants out of the European Union and France to become autonomous again. There's a lot of dissension in France politically about the whole European Union, just not economically as much as, and also because of the terrorist attack, they feel that's probably political capital. I don't think if France had been an independent nation, the terrorist attacks wouldn't have still happened on the basis of how they happened. But certainly we're seeing a lot of interest in France, actually, ironically, who's urging, I think there was a retired general, I forget my French, Tarzan, and he's apparently a presidential candidate for the 2017 elections, and he urged the EU nations to distance themselves from NATO when forming this new proposed defence union called Defence Schengen. I don't exactly know all the details about it, but he actually stated Russia was no longer an enemy of Europe, and this new defence initiative should serve European interests and not Washington's, which are clearly are asynchronous. I think this is just another example of why deeply fractured NATO is, particularly with regards to Washington, and why we've seen this idea that all this talk of a European army and everyone's going into cabal, that they're going to, no. Europe wants its own army because it wants to get rid of the US and out of Europe and to become autonomous in its own right. And if Europe wants to have its own army, doesn't make it cabal. Why does it have to be? In future, the future of the world will be, if there's an uprising in a nation, a proper world army, for want of a better word, is going to go in and deal with these problems and eradicate them and say, okay, this is how the world operates in future. We have a collective approach to a problem. We're not going to allow the people creating the problem to exploit a nation to do this anymore, or if there is these uprisings that happen and to destabilize the nation, we're not going to allow this to happen. But people still get this idea that if we have a global approach to something, it has to be cabal. Well, no, it doesn't. The UN, if the UN had been doing what the UN should have done, which of course it didn't because it was cabal control, it could be very successful in terms of how it dealt with humanitarian crises and those sort of events and anything related to civil war or wars between nations that were obviously, as we know, all this was cabal induced, which is why the UN didn't do anything to stop it and didn't do what it was supposed to do. But it's back to the old thing. There's nothing wrong with the apparatus. It's the lunatics who run it. So why can't we have, if Russia, China and Iran and Turkey can start to deal with problems in Syria collectively in a mature, sensible approach and deals with a problem, fantastic. I don't care who gets involved in the process. Let's just have a collective way of dealing with these problems and going about it, and stop believing that everything is a cabal plot. And that's the other problem. All I keep seeing is every time I see, it's the cabal doing this, it's the cabal doing it. No, it's not the cabal doing it. If Europe wants to have its own army, to deal with problems, let it have its own army. If that's a democratic view and it's not about the cabal, let them do it. It's their choice. Not for us to dictate. Britain certainly is not going to take part and have a European army, because Britain wants to do its own thing, and that's exactly what it's doing there in terms of wanting to be out of the European Union. And because Britain always likes to just do what Britain wants to do, well, that's Britain's entitlement. If nations want to join Russia, and Germany might in the future want to join the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is kind of an alternative to NATO, well, maybe it wants to do that. Let it do it. Nations will be free to choose what they want to do. And so I think we need to just be a little bit careful we don't suspect that everything that's happening is a cabal plot, because it isn't. A lot of these changes have nothing to do with the cabal.
Well, I can understand why people think that it's a cabal plot, but I can also see why people see the danger in that. Because if you've got a European army that is going to go into a country because there's some dissent, to me that just seems like a really, really dangerous thing.
No, that's not dissent that the people have had enough of the government, or they just, the government's extreme. No. If you had a terror, let's just say, for example, and I know this actually was the case, when the French started to have these terrorist attacks in France, the German Secret Service and the military said to the French, we'll work with you in combination to eradicate this problem. And they refused and said, no. That's the kind of collective approach. If we suddenly have a systemic threat to a nation, be it the UK or France or Holland or Germany, and Europe has a collective approach or wants to have that approach because it's a democratic decision to deal with a systemic threat to a nation, why we should allow that to happen. We're not talking. This isn't about, if you or I form a political party and we have a dissension because we don't like this, they're just going to come in and have a European army that's going to crush it. No, that's not what the future's about. The future's about dealing with problems that are a systemic threat to a nation. And if it needs assistance from other nations, in terms of intelligence or military capability or whatever it might be, they can do it. That's precisely what Syria have done. Syria had Russia initially to help them. Then the Chinese covertly came and got involved, and now they're publicly admitting they're involved. Iran are now getting involved. Turkey are now getting involved. Is that detrimental to the Syrian people if all these nations
No,
get involved?
It's not. No, but it's exactly. But this has happened out of what's going on in Syria. It's not happened because these things were in place beforehand. Now, if you've got these things in place beforehand, whoever controls that can control what really goes on. And when you say democratically, democracy, we all know that democracy has been bastardized and completely upside down.
Yeah, but we're not talking about the world as it exists now. We're talking about how the future is. How the world exists now, absolutely. But a European army doesn't exist now, and it may not even exist in the future. But in a post-cabal world, if the European nations want to have that, then that's their choice. If it's done democratically and there's a will of the people to want to have that, to deal with future problems, that's up to them. That's their right to do it. But I'm not looking at this through the eyes of a cabal world. This is not, we're looking at it through the eyes of a world that's changing. The problem is the rest, large parts of the world don't see the world the way the West does. The West is still looking at everything as though the cabal are in charge. Everything that's coming about at the moment is the cabal. Every initiative, it's the cabal. Every little nuance that's slightly different, it's the cabal. Well, why does it have to be? I mean, we're seeing all over the world how nations are standing up against the cabal and are refusing to cooperate and acquiesce to them. But the problem is in Europe and also the US, we still have this idea that every little change, it's just the cabal, or it's a cabal faction fighting another one, and they're just trying to jostle for power and position and authority. No, it's not. Germany's a good example where privately there are talks going on to get themselves out the mess they're in and obviously to fully rotate and be part of the new Silk Road and what I call the Berlin kind of Moscow, now Tehran and Beijing axis. And you might put Ankara in that in the near future. And and it'll grow and expand. And it's to grow that whole new multipolar world, and Germany will go in, and they'll probably maybe have to drag France along to a certain extent, or maybe not. We're starting to see France changing as well. And people will say, well, Sarkozy was the prime minister, so therefore, or he's the president, so therefore he must be cabal. So he's still cabal, and therefore if he says this, it's cabal. No, the world's changing. We've got to stop looking at everything as it was or as it is now, and as though nothing's going to ever change. And the whole point is, it is changing, and the world is reshaping. And we're starting to see a lot of people talk, and France is a great example of that, where they're saying, we don't want this anymore. We want to change. We want Europe to change. And Merkel will come out and say, we're wanting more integration in Europe. That's just a mouthpiece. I mean, for Washington. But the rest of Europe doesn't think that, because if Italy really thought that, they wouldn't be doing the things they're doing, particularly with Russia, but also with China. And France, clearly, they had a lot of representation at the St. Petersburg Forum in Russia, where they're wanting to work with Russia and find ways to get around the sanctions. And we all know the sanctions, actually, most European nations aren't even trying to bypass them. They're actually just flagrantly going, screw this, we're just going to do what we want to do, and we're going to trade with Russia and carry on, because it's damaging us and causing us huge, economic problems by having to actually acquiesce to a Washington edict. Meanwhile, actually, Washington's not even obeying any of the sanctions that it tells Europe to impose on Russia, which is obviously not surprising, but it's hugely hypocritical. So the world's changing. We have to start to look at the things that are happening now and not just assume it's the cabal doing it.
Yeah, but you can understand people jumping to that conclusion when all they've really known, especially if you're under, or if you're in your 20s or 30s, that's all you've really known is this cabal. Now, I think people will. Susie Q makes a good point. I think people will accept that there is change happening when we start to see some indictments for war crimes from these people in the cabal. And so I can understand that there are people out there, and I know what you're saying when you say everyone, that a certain people jump on everything and think it's a cabal plot, or it's an inside job, or it's this, or it's that, or it's other, and they don't really seem to move from that standpoint, even though each individual case is different. But what will change people's minds and feel like there is change coming is when people are indicted for war crimes. And Susie Q says, at what point do you feel that indictments will be issued for the many war crimes of the cabal?
Do you know what? This might sound an outrageous thing to say. I'm not even sure that will happen. Because, and the reason I say that is, I'm not saying it won't, but look, the problem we have is that it's like, okay, we had, when the whole Nazi empire collapsed at the end of World War II, there was the Nuremberg trial, which was tokenism. It didn't really deal with the problem. Yeah, you literally hung some people out to dry. I made an example of them, but it didn't deal with a lot of the problems, and we saw years later where it still happened. There's no doubt at some point there will be people will certainly have to be accountable for what they've done. The question is, how do we make that accountability stick? And I'm not saying that may sound ridiculous, but we have to be extremely careful that we start to indict people, that we indict them in a way that we can make whatever charges should stick. But my focus isn't on that happening. Yes, there needs to be accountability so people realise who's been responsible and what they've done. But that's not going to be, well, if we arrest all the cabal and we try them in court and then everyone will believe it. No, people will go, my God, what the hell have they done? But until people see tangible change in their lives every day, which is what I want to see. Yes, I don't want to see these lunatics running around having any control anymore, and they need to be removed from power, and the world needs to restore some order in terms of nations having a real democracy instead of the pseudo-democracy. is that really going to happen? I'll be honest with you. I've talked to people at great length for quite a long time about this. I've never once heard anybody say to me there's going to be mass arrest. You mentioned mass arrest to go, that's not even figured in anyone's thinking at this point in time. I mean, there was a school of thought that, a lot of them may just decide they can't stand living in this world when they no longer have control and they'll end their own lives, or, some of them may get hunted down and killed for what they've done. But the idea of this whole mass arrest thing, no one's ever discussed it and said it to me. And these people have a pretty good handle on what's going on. So that's why it might sound outrageous to say it, but I'm not even sure that's going to happen, or has actually figured in the thinking of at this point in time as to what needs to be done. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, Syria is an extreme example of what's going on. But you have to restore order. You have to remove the problem. You have to rebuild the country and start to get some stability. Then you start to go, well, okay, what are we going to do about accountability? That comes further down the track. And I don't think the accountability angle on this mass arrest scenario is something, the cabal fell over tomorrow and the world started to change. I don't think that's going to happen for a considerable period of time afterwards. And I really don't see that. I don't mean to, because I know a lot of people attach great importance to that, and I'm not trivializing it is important, but I don't think it's something that's going to happen as soon as perhaps people believe will happen. So maybe I'm just trying to manage people's expectation of it. Don't get disheartened if that sort of thing doesn't happen as soon as you would hope it would happen, because there is a huge amount of other changes and things that have to happen that actually, from a global perspective, is far more important, even though, for a lot of people, that is the most important thing, and I understand why they feel that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I do get what you're saying. I do, but my point primarily was the change isn't going to happen until people realise that the change is there, and I just want to. How are people going to know that? Well, hang on a minute, just a second, and feel empowered, because that's what's going to happen. We're a little bit of a victim of our own nature. I remember my granddad telling me a story about when he was in World War II, and he said that the war should have been over months before, but because people felt they were coming to the end of it, they weren't so prepared to get stuck in, and so it sort of people backed off, and eventually they got over the line, and the war ended. I mean, this is coming from a guy who was there, so whatever you feel about the war, but that's how he felt. So do you think that we're sort of a victim of our own own nature, whereas we feel like we're getting to the end now, but there's not so many people wanting to put their head above the parapet and think that they can perhaps do that a little bit later on when it's all done?
No, well, I think the problem is from our perspective in the UK, a lot of people don't have a clue that anything's happened, and we've seen, we've had some high-profile people, who've been, Jimmy Savile's a great example. It caused massive shock amongst people, and yet, people didn't see it in a broader context. They saw it in the case of just one individual and what he was, people said, what he'd actually done in life. We know what a high-profile person he was in the BBC over here, et cetera, So we've seen instances where people have found out things, and they have, it's kind of shocked them for a bit, and then it gets forgotten. Realistically, if the financial system collapsed tomorrow, and people suddenly can't go and get money out of their ATM, that's going to be a massive kind of what the hell happened moment. This is 2008 all over again, but on steroids, as I've referred to it. So that's a kind of wake-up call that you're going to give people. It's not a pleasant one, and maybe we can avoid a global catastrophe in terms of the financial system. Although increasingly, it's looking very, very precarious as to how we can avoid that. And what certainly is true is Russia and China are sat there just watching the West, going, "You just carry on. You implode, your choice. You're making those decisions. We're not going to do anything to stop it, but we're certainly not going to do anything to encourage it. I mean, they'll carry on doing what they're doing, and de-dollarization is certainly causing the capitulation of the cabal. We know that. But you can't start saying, well, actually, to the world, you know what? Russia started doing trade with Iran. Russia's trading with Italy. Russia's trading with every nation on the planet, as is China. That's the reason why our financial system collapsed. No one's going to buy that. No one would believe it. But they took overt action, and people would believe it. So that is probably the most likely scenario, that the financial system will just grind to a halt, and then people will go, hang on, what the hell's happening? And then you'll see the death of the cabal, because it is a financial war. It always has been a financial war, and when they lose the financial war, it's the end of it. And change will come about. I mean, you know, Germany's a great example that no one knew that, well, none of the public knew that German, you know, East and West was going to be reunified, that the wall would come down, that the Soviet Union as an empire would collapse. Okay, it doesn't matter who was responsible. We know the cabal were responsible, but in part, a large part for it, and Germany actually had to have conditions to reunify. But nobody knew that was going to happen. Now, of course, the wall comes down and everyone goes, wow, it's the end of communism, and Germany reunifies. But Germany didn't. There isn't these grandiose events. Germany just integrated, reunified. Did we see huge mass arrest of Stasi for what they did to the East German people? No, there's no evidence of that happening. Were there these huge, big, grandiose events for people to realise? No, the world changed and Germany integrated. And if you remove the cabal and things start to integrate and nations cooperate with each other and governments start to work for their people, and we see this transition, it's far more likely that that's what's going to happen, rather than these big, grandiose sort of ideas that humanity's going to get this massive wake-up call. And in some ways, we've got to be careful. If you do wake people up massively, are they going to be able to handle? You know, I mean, I'm all for, we have to have disclosure of everything. We absolutely do, and we can't hide what's happened in the past, because otherwise we're likely to repeat the same mistakes pretty quickly again, and we need to avoid that at all costs. But I'm not kind of this view that we might see these big, grandiose events that will wake people up and you know, almost showcase trials to. It may happen. I'm not saying it won't, and there is a possibility it will. But I've not heard that is going to happen yet. But you know, let's not rule anything out. It's a possibility. But maybe a lot of change will be more subtle. But at some point, yeah, people have to be aware of what was really going on and who caused what they did, who was responsible for world wars, who were responsible for the plight of billions of people in history across the world, and the lives they've had so unnecessarily had to lead. So I guess that's probably more, from my perspective, what's likely to happen in the short term. But I don't know. There's a lot of grey areas in terms of exactly what's going to happen. Of course, we don't know, because if you take 60 million people in the UK and how they're going to react in a post-cabal world to what's going to happen, we don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who don't know much. I mean, I know someone at the moment who I got to know recently who doesn't really know a huge amount about what's going on, but I've talked to him about it, and he's like, well, whatever changes have to happen, if it's going to improve the lives of people, I'm happy at it. I can put it with short-term or medium-term problems, but if it changes the world, makes a better place for my children and for my family, I'm all for it. Let's see it happen. And he's really quite relaxed about it. Whereas I think there's a lot of people in the alternative community who know about it, who they're the ones living in panic all the time. They're the ones who are really terrified of the change that's coming, and they're the ones I think, ironically, some of them will struggle more than the people who don't know anything.
Andy, I think you're off, aren't you?
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, do you see it that when the present system changes or falls apart or whatever happens, that the reason we perhaps won't get this revenge, if you like, is because people are going to have a lot more on their plate. They're going to need to do a lot more than just seek revenge.
I think initially, yes, very much. I think, a lot of people have felt, oh, well, once you get rid of the cabal, it's plain sailing. We can all stroll into the sunset and the world will be a great place. The hard work started to reshape the world and rebuild it. And, we're a long way behind the Eastern nations, Russia, China, and they've got a long way to go still. But they've been making huge changes for a long period of time, and where we in the West haven't done that. And yeah, there's a lot of work. I mean, it's interesting that the Chinese Communist Party 95th anniversary last month, Xi Jinping delivered this speech where he called for a military union with Russia that would render NATO powerless and put an end to the imperialistic desires of the West. But he made this incredible statement where he said the world is on the verge of radical change. We see how the European Union is collapsing, as is the US economy. It is all over for the New World Order. That's exactly what he said. Now, that is about as definitive a statement as you'll ever get out of the Chinese, that the world is on the verge of radical change. And this radical change is going to mean that when the European Union goes, nations get their own autonomy back. Well, how are they going to work with each other? Are they going to continue in the European Union, but in a way that it should have always been? Or do they want to have autonomy? Well, they're going to sign individual trade agreements. How is it going to affect nations? What are are nations going to start to have a manufacturing base? Is all the new technology going to be rolled out? When's it going to be rolled out? I'm all for that. We have to have accountability, but I'm far more concerned that we start to focus our energy on rebuilding the world. Yes, there needs to be accountability, but let's rebuild the world. Let's rebuild our nations how they should have been, and let's put the focus on that. Let the legal system handle the problem of dealing with whoever's responsible, and ultimately, that's going to be an interesting question. How the hell are we going to make it stick with some people in terms of accountability and responsibility? And I think there's going to be a few headaches in that regard, but I'm less focused on that. I want to start to see evidence of how we're going to change the world in it, or have it in a post-cabal world. How do we change the UK? How does Europe change? How does America change?
Well, America seems to have changed. Its perception around the world seems to have changed a lot. Did you, and if you did, can you comment on it? Did you read about was it the president of the Philippines who made some derogatory comments about America?
Yeah, and also said, basically, screw the UN. We don't want to be part of it. And then some minister came out and said, well, he didn't quite mean that. Well, yeah, he did mean it. Of course, people are sick, and it's not the US people. They're sick of Washington. They're sick of what they're doing. But you know what? They actually now have the strength and belief they can come out and publicly say this, because they have the support of other nations, and they and also because the US cabal, or the US Washington, or whatever you want to refer to it, is very weak now. I mean, incredibly weak, and so they don't have the power and authority they once did to stomp all over nations. And yeah, they're still trying to meddle now in India, as far as I can see. So they're not going to give up easily, but they are very weak, and they're just moving from one nation to the other, and they're getting short shrift, and people have just had enough. Don't want anything to do with them anymore. They want them out their nation. They want them out of the world stage, and they just they see what is achievable in having a multipolar world where people do work together, and it is for mutual benefit in the real sense of the word. And that is the future, and we just need to grasp it with both hands and believe it and accept that it's a reality, because it is. But because just look at countries, 70% of the world's population is embracing that now. And yet it is a long road. It's not going to change overnight. There are difficulties. Nations are going to have to get over healing the wounds between them. Japan and China are two great examples. That's not going to change overnight. And there is a lot of anger between and animosity. There's common ground to work towards, and to build a better relationships which will work for both nations, and together, and also individually. So these are important considerations, and if we look at it, we're starting to increasingly see more and more statements coming out from very unlikely sources, where the Deutsche Bank recently came out and said they reached this conclusion, very unsurprising, that they said without an external economic shock, it's hard to see policymakers being prepared to take dramatic fiscal action, financial action, monetary action to jumpstart the global economy and bouncing out of a financial repression. Now, what Deutsche Bank's effectively saying is, this financial system we're part of is dead. It's over. They've got no tools at their disposal. They can't make any changes. They've wrecked the economy. So what we're going to do is we're just going to have this external economic shock is already in train. We know it. And it's an admission and a resignation to the fake seal. So there's a lot of recognition now in the West that it's a fait accompli what's going to happen. So nations are going to start talking. And just because Merkel and Hollande and Renzi get together, everyone goes, oh, it's another cabal attempt to try and subvert Europe. And no, maybe they're actually sitting down, and maybe Germany is telling its people that stockpile food, and because there's a realization, you know what, we're in this mess, it's going to happen. What are we going to do to try and mitigate some of the major problems we're facing? And there's no doubt, I expect, not only of those three talked, I no doubt there's other ministers from other nations involved in private discussions talking precisely the same language, that they are facing this future. They know it's coming. Well, what are we going to try and do about it to try and mitigate the problem? And this doesn't mean that it's the cabal involved. Yeah, you might argue, say, oh, well, it must be because Merkel's involved. But Merkel's not really calling the shots in Germany now anyway, as we know, because she's not privy to discussions that are going on with Russia and China and Germany.
Yeah. So how do you see it? I just want to go back to how you see things post the cabal, and once we've got rid of them once and for all. And how would you see? Are you talking more about consensus rather than when you talk about like a European army, for example? Are you talking about consensus, or are you talking about laws, obligations being cast upon people?
No, it's not. It's a consensus. It's, if nations in Europe want to have that, and, democratic decisions are made, real democratic decisions, and it's the will of people to want to have an army, for what, in want of a better word, if there is problems within their nations that need that kind of intervention, then they will do it. Maybe it will be security services will all work together, share information far more, and cooperate. And that's the extent of what a European army might be, for want of a better word. But yeah, it's a consensus about what the people of nations want. And the world, if we take the UK as an example, if we actually had a government, and people say, well, we don't need governance. Well, okay, if you don't want governance, fine. Well, okay, so you're all going to have 65 million people with 65 million different views. Tell me how that version's going to work. It can't possibly work. People have to work. But if we had a government that works for the betterment of people, actually does things to help people, so people are the most vulnerable and needy are provided for, that actually looks to build a nation with a proper, strong economy, because everyone isn't going to, in the new world, be able to sit at home with their food replicators and their free energy and watch the world go by and do nothing. That isn't the way the world's going to be. And if people want to do that, I'd question, well, hang on a minute, you just want to sit around, you don't want to work, for the betterment of your nation and the betterment of the world, to help each other, you just want to sit around and do nothing. Well, sorry to say, that isn't going to happen anyway. It has to be a collective approach where we all realise we all have skills and abilities, and we can all bring those to the party, so to speak, and work for the betterment of each other and heal the great wounds and divisions. I mean, we talk about worrying about how we're going to deal with the cabal. Let's start to worry about how we heal the wounds and divisions that exist in our own nation. And it can be on the grounds of religion. It can be on the grounds of race. It can be on the grounds of ethnicity and all manner of things that people have a particular problem is because they've been indoctrinated and subverted to believe these things. I think that, for me, that's far more important that we sort our own problems out with each other than worrying about the lunatics who did run it, who no longer do run it. Let whoever in the world is going to handle that, and probably there will be, maybe there is going to be a European army that's going to handle the lunatics that are running around in Europe. maybe there's a world army that's going to handle these people. Let them deal with that. Let us start to realise that we as people, we want to have the power and we want to have the, to run our nations. We're going to have to start taking that responsibility, and it starts with how we work, we deal with each other, how we interact with each other. And then, yes, that we need some form of governance, but not a cabal government, because we're still going to need to provide. How are we going to provide for people in our old age? How do we provide for an aging population? We're still going to need to have a social welfare system that supports them and provides for them. Well, therefore, you have to have some form of governance. You have to have some form of taxation, in inverted commas, that pays for all this. But is it done in a way that will benefit everybody and we're not screwing everyone over and destroying their lives in the process? Well, yeah. Is there a different monetary system 10 years, 5 years down the track? Yes, very likely. But we have to go. We can't just jump from a cabal existence to some utopian idea in 5 minutes. We're going to have to do it in a step-by-step process. And people are going to have to be extremely patient to see, this a kind of utopian, for want of a better word, existence, because it can't happen overnight. It takes time. German integration, which was a far simpler issue, still took a relatively long period of time, and the Germans worked really hard to make it happen, relatively quickly. But there was a will amongst the people to make that happen. Well, multiply that manifold across the world. And also, it's not just, then we're going to have to heal wounds, because let's look at Ireland and England. We have a really bad history, or the UK. Between those nations, we have to heal those kind of wounds, because there's a lot of people who feel very aggrieved by what's happened in the last 30, 40, 50 years, 100 years, and throughout the history. So there's just one example. Then we have problems between nations in Europe that don't get on. I mean, Cyprus and Turkey are Greece and Turkey are two great examples. Look at Cyprus, what happened to that? There's a nation that's completely divided. We've got all the former the Balkan republics. You've got Croatia and Serbia and all these nations who hate each other for from their eyes, justifiable reason. You've got to heal these wounds, because if we don't, we're never going to get to the root cause of the problem, which was all about divide and conquer by the cabal. So we have to make this happen. And for me, that's far more important than worrying about, well, actually, there was these lunatics, let's round them up and deal with them. That will happen. I mean, I said before, I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't happen. I mean, it's unlikely. It probably will happen, but I don't think it will happen straight away. If it does happen straight away, fine. If it's possible to do that, but let's focus on what we need to do collectively in a global sense and within nations to resolve the massive problems that we currently have in disparity between the people who have everything and the people who have nothing, and readdressing that and trying to create a world on a level playing field for all people.
Thanks, Paul. A little while back, you did mention our newly elected Prime Minister, Theresa May, and as far as I'm aware, she wasn't actually elected as Prime Minister.
No, that's very true. Yeah, you're absolutely right. No, she wasn't elected. She just assumed the throne, so to speak.
Oh, yeah, it was more of a
No, you're absolutely right. My slip of my tongue now, I'm absolutely wrong. She wasn't elected. No, you're absolutely right.
We've got a question, another one from Susie Q. Thanks for the great question, Susie. And she's saying, Paul, we in the US are confused about where Theresa May stands. Who is she aligned with?
That's a brilliant question. Do you know what? Because Lisa and I had this exact conversation on several occasions. Well, that, I mean, the proof of the pudding will be, is it rhetoric talking to Putin? The day I see May turning up, shaking hands with Putin, and coming out with statements that clearly show there's a move to a different world, then yeah, we'll believe it. When we start to see real change, the United Kingdom away from the insanity that's run this nation, particularly, I would say, in the last 20 odd years. And that, I mean, what Thatcher did was bad enough, but what happened in the Blair era was far worse in many ways. So are we going to start to see those kind of social issues addressed? Are we going to see a change in how we deal with internal matters, how we handle external matters? I mean, we have to listen to the rhetoric coming out. I mean, Boris Johnson came out and basically said we need to bury the hatchet with Russia and mend, the ties and secure a solid future working together. Does he mean this? Well, the proof of the pudding is going to be in what actually happens. Words are cheap; it's actions that speak louder, as we know. And I think that's the point we have to before we can make a proper judgment. It's entirely possible that she's going to be the future, and she is going to become a real prime minister. But at the moment, who knows? We can't really tell because really nothing's changed, and there's a lot of words, but summer recess is on, and politics goes very quiet, and everyone falls asleep about it. So, I guess we'll see in the near future as to whether she represents a real change or doesn't.
I suppose, as Patrick's commented in the chat room, the fact that her other half is one of the major shareholders of G4S kind of gives a bit of a clue as to where who she's aligned with, and can that possibly be a smokescreen to someone who's out there to do any good? I mean, I haven't seen any evidence from what May's said and done since she assumed office that she's going to be any better. In fact, probably a lot worse than David Cameron.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the proof the pudding's going to be in, but in the eating, and we'll see what exactly happens or doesn't happen. And at the moment, we don't know. I mean, what I would say is I do believe she must be aware of something to do with what's coming down the track financially. It must be aware that the world's changing, and these people, they're seeing it actually happen. It's not happening behind closed doors anymore. It's happening fully in their face every day of the week in the public eye. So they must be aware of something. They may not be aware exactly what's going on, but I suspect they know enough. The question is, do they represent the new future? Well, at some point, someone who has been part of this cabal system, whether they know it or don't know it, and that's equally an interesting observation, because I think some of them genuinely don't have a clue what's going on. They're that insulated from reality that they don't see it. But at some point, someone who's part of the system now is going to have to assume some interim role or some kind of measure to transition the UK, for example. So maybe at some point May will come out and say some amazing things and change things. I don't know. Maybe it's her. Maybe it isn't her. Maybe she doesn't isn't part of that plan and that change. I don't know. But at some point these changes will come to pass. But I mean, like anything, the problem is we don't really know but we certainly know changes are happening. I mean, Britain is certainly softening its stance. It's not coming out with the foaming at the mouth rhetoric about Russia as it has been in previous, even during the Cameron era. Well, that's gone very quiet. Yeah, Britain scored a bit of an own goal over the Hinkley nuclear power station. I don't think British people are too displeased about that happening, but Chinese are absolutely livid about that. But maybe there's some reason for that, and time will tell what the rationale behind effectively pulling the plug or delaying it, which is often a euphemism for pulling the plug on it. But yeah, it's
Mrs. T, isn't it? Because everybody, if you believe the gulch in the mainstream media, everybody loved the first Mrs. T, and now we've got another Mrs. T, and I think they're probably going to be equally as loved and missed when they die. Well,
time will tell. I think we'll know within the next. Well, actually, it depends what happens in global sense and what events unfold. But I think we'll know pretty soon whether she's just more of the same or will, ultimately be someone different. But at some point, one of these people, whether it's her or someone else, is going to have to come out and perform a major U-turn and change their perspective. I mean, and to a large extent, you can say that at some point Putin started to change hugely. Yeah, he was very pro-Russia and resolving Russia's difficulties, but then suddenly he changed and started to go, well, actually on a world stage, we're going to have to start getting involved and making changes there and doing things. And these are more subtle changes, but there's a lot. Erdogan's a great example. Do we trust him? Well, no. I don't think anyone trusts him. I don't think Russia trusts him, but he's making changes and things are starting to happen. What's radically changed in him as a person? Well, personality-wise, probably nothing. But he's certainly doing things differently, and will he keep doing that? Well, time will tell. So that's the kind of scenario that we're likely to see, where people in Western nations will suddenly just start to do things differently. And then those of us who are kind of aware of things to a larger or lesser extent will be, wow, that was a bit of a surprise move. And in fact, I think we'll start to see some more of these kind of surprise moves happening.
It wouldn't surprise me if there were a lot more activity, terrorist activity in Turkey, because I think that he's gone the opposite way, and so I would have thought there'd be some sort of penalty for that. He seems to.
Yeah, there's likely to be reprisals, but I think on the back of that, Russia's probably also had a word in the ear of a certain nation that, if that starts to happen, there'll be repercussions.
But was it a child suicide attacker at a Turkish wedding at the weekend? Did you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting things won't happen, but and there's no doubt there will be repercussions. There always is, but I think there'll be a point where certainly Russia will turn to the whoever, knowing full well that largely it is a Washington, U.S. cabal-led initiative. The whole ISIS thing, it's a statement of the obvious. They're responsible. They were for Al-Qaeda. That at some point Russia's going to turn around and say, do you know what? I suggest you put a stop to this, because if you don't, there's going to be repercussions. And there will be repercussions, because there'll come a tipping point where, if Russia and China really wanted to, they could destroy the dollar and collapse the US tomorrow. They could have done it 3 or 4 years ago. They probably would have been a very foolish thing to do, and I would suggest it was a foolish thing to do now, because 4 years ago they were in no way, shape, or form, had any economic, financial platform to be able to just sink it and say it doesn't really affect us. I'm not saying they will do it, but they have the capability to do it, and the US knows it. Also, the US knows that militarily the Russians are light years ahead, so these kind of things will start to factor into their thinking. And the question is, where's the white knight, for want of a better word, in the US? We talk about maybe possibly a catalyst, or maybe not, for a big kind of change in terms of how the UK behaves. Where's that person in the US? And I know people are going to say, well, we certainly know it's not Clinton. And then there's people who say, well, Trump's cabal. Well, no, Trump is not cabal. Is Trump, would I want Trump as the president? Well, maybe not, but is he likely to be the president? Well, probably. It was said to me 2 years ago, before he even stood to run, he'll be the next US president, provided the cabal don't kill him. Well, it's very likely he could be the next US president. Is he the guy who's going to change the US? Well, I don't know. That's a good question. He says a lot of things that are outrageous and unacceptable, but equally says some things that I would think would be, if they were to be, his policies were introduced, would be very hugely beneficial to the American people. Time will tell. Will he be the interim guy to lead the US to the new world? It's a possibility. I don't know. But these are the kind of things we will have to start to look out for more increasingly in the West, to see evidence of comments and statements that people have made that suggest a change. And we're seeing that rhetoric coming out of France. We've seen it coming out of Italy and Austria and certain people in Germany, Holland as well. We're starting to see comments that are more in line with how we want to see the future, and rather than the current kind of status quo the cabal's had for the Rothschild dynasty files show for 250 years. Pretty much.
Thank you for that, Paul. And I've just noticed we've come to the end of the 2 hours, or very close. So thank you very much, Paul and Lisa, for tonight's update, to this the August update from the Sirius Report.
Yeah, where did Lisa go?
I'm here.
Oh, there you go.
Yes, we've all got a good woman in the background, and sometimes it's nice to hear them speaking out.
Absolutely, and Lisa does a huge amount of great work, and behind the scenes, I'm the one who does all the talking. And, but no, Lisa does a lot of great stuff. I mean, the website is down to her, and the whole Sirius Report full stop's down to her, because without her encouragement, I would have never have done this. So, I mean, some people might think, well, I wish you never had, Paul, but hopefully there's a lot of people out there who are glad that what we're doing and what we're trying to do. So,
Okay.
Big hats off to her.
Yep. I just need to let everyone know that we'll be back usual time of 7 p.m. on Thursday. And this Thursday, fingers crossed, hoping the wind's blowing in the right direction, we'll be joined by Andrew Johnson. It can't be... it can't have the same thing again. So hopefully that'll work out fine. We'll be back at 7 o'clock. Thank you, Paul and Lisa. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Tony, for getting us out of the doo-doo technically tonight. And thank you to everyone who listened.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone, and good night.
Good night.